Hello, everyone, and welcome to Writers Drinking Coffee. This is a podcast where writers sit around drinking tasty beverages to talk about writing, publishing, and the whole creative process. There will be rants and raves and opinions that may not agree but are lovingly delivered. We will not censor ourselves. We refuse. So consider us PG-13. Today, your hosts are Chaz Brinchley and me, Jeannie Warner. This is episode 207, The Literary Memoirs of Alma Alexander. Welcome back, Alma.
Hey there, nice to be back. Thanks for having me.
I have to say, you're one of my favorite writers and people to talk to because I always get excited about things. And by things, I mean everything in the world whenever I talk to you. So you're one of my muses, and I appreciate that about you.
Thank you.
Today we are here because you sent us an early copy of Alchemy of the Word, Dreams and Transformations. And I have to say, I love this. When I was first reading through the first 3 chapters, I'm like, this is the most unique autobiography I have ever read. And I love it that way because in much the way I started thinking about people talk about their favorite books, I'm like, well, that was my favorite book in 2nd grade, but then I loved this book in 3rd grade. And, you know, my grandmother had all of Mishner and Clavel, so that's what I read, 3rd and 4th grade. And I finally reading your book of your literary memoirs, I felt close to you, like we were sitting around in comfy chairs with our feet up together, a cat on each of our laps.
And talking books.
Yes.
Basically, what this literally is I don't know about you guys, but certainly when it comes to myself, and I know a lot of people who are very much the same, when you walk into anybody's house for the first time and you don't know this person very well, but you notice a bookshelf in the corner, and you wait until he goes out of the room to turn the roast or to put the kid to bed or to let the cat in, and then you kind of sidle up to the bookshelf and you look at it. You will either find all the old friends that you hope to find there, and you know that this is your people. You might find sort of crossed bridge that you can get to being able to communicate with, but it won't be entirely your neck of the woods. Or you're going to look at that bookshelf and you're going to go, I want to get out of here now.
I watched somebody's apartment in Cat for a week, and she was a lovely, lovely woman, my peer, roughly the same age. And her cat was she was fussy on behalf of her cat. She had left pre-cooked meals for each meal. And her cat needed freshly filtered spring water twice a day. No, don't just, I'm not judging here. I'm just saying this was all very well and good. But then I went and I looked at her bookcases and I'm like, oh, she's not really my core people in some of this. I mean, there's overlap, but sometimes the grouping even is just off somehow.
Yeah.
This goes with me. When we moved to New Zealand, and my father and I were out there trying to find a house to buy, and we were out looking at houses, so we were being taken out to look to tour places by the agent that was dealing with us. And I walked into this one house and it felt like I was walking into shadows, and I didn't know why. It was just filled with darkness and cobwebs and this brooding air of malice. I don't know. It just, and then I realized why, because there wasn't a book in the place.
Mm-hmm.
There were no bookshelves. There wasn't even a Gideon Bible on the nightstand. There was no books in there at all. Like, that's so evil.
I have a friend in the UK. She's a writer. She's a very well-published writer. And I visited her in her home. And I'm confident that she does have books, but she has no books in the public rooms. No books are on display in the living room or the sitting room. And that I just find completely weird.
Well, I visited a gal that I worked with. It was in tech, and she was a lovely woman in marketing, and we were all talking at an event about this and that, and I was saying, oh, we have Pennsic coming up, and then I had hockey, and my friend was talking about, and this girl who was with us, she suddenly burst out, oh my God, I'm boring. And we were like, oh no, darling, I'm sure you're not. But then I visited her house, and she stops work, and she and her husband would sit down in front of trays, and they would watch TV and go to beds. And they had all of this empty white wall space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think it wasn't the dark cobwebby feeling, but it was a
blankness.
She was a tabula rasa upon which I have bought her books over the years just because it hurt me so much.
A lacuna of spirit. It's just this empty space that not filling. And for people like me who, I mean, you say that there's no books in the public rooms. I mean, I don't have a room which doesn't have books in it.
Right, exactly. I don't have a wall that doesn't have books on it.
I want to say, though, that you two beloved, I'm going to say dinosaurs. I'm sorry, Ches. I'm looking for kids today, and I'm holding my palm in my hand and saying, this, in the palm of my hand, I have, according to Kindle, I have 1,200 books right now. And the advantage is they can change font sizes as my eyes suck more.
Yeah.
It just doesn't smell right, does it?
No, I understand all the advantages of ebooks, and I expect to be incredibly grateful for them when I can no longer, maintain a library physically.
I'm sticking my tongue out at him right now.
But at the moment, my habit is to read with a book in my hand. And I'm 65 years old, for God's sake. I've been doing it all my life.
Fair.
I prefer it.
I understand that, but, lighting being what it is and all of that, I just want to say a shout out to the next generation. Namaste to your e-readers and the different ways that you buy and consume books, because there's no wrong way. But I think in your childhood, somebody read you a book, and to at least have at least one of those two memories, it's like having that stuffed animal that you still keep with you, later, right?
Softly Bear goes everywhere with me.
Well, yes.
Been with me since I was 3.
Yeah, but I was a year old and he was handed to me on my first birthday, and he was bigger than I am, and he would move to 3 continents with me.
Yep.
Absolutely. And I'm saying that in some way, I loved your book for the alchemy of the word for the way that it brought back all of those favored, if I may compare a book to a stuffed animal, and I think I can. It brought those back to me. We had different stuffed animals, you and I, but a bunch of ours were still the same. For one of it, I loved is your moving tribute to Ursula Le Guin, and you brought up the chicken cages, and I suddenly was forced to run out to the internet to look up and saying, oh, you're right, they were going to outlaw those, but then they haven't yet. But now they haven't. And so then it sent me down a whole look of things that Ursula Le Guin cared about raising chickens in a humane manner. And I didn't even know that aspect with her. And you gave me that. So thank you.
I'm happy to be delivering Ursula Le Guin's chickens.
There were so many other little pieces about it that you had in the book that way of saying, I also had recently discovered that I adored Alex Harrow and her way of words.
I read the first novel of hers that I read, and I put that down, and then I went to the internet and I said, what else has she written? And please take my money now.
Yep.
Did that with Kevin Hearn, because Kevin Hearn and his Iron Druid set in the worst of these elections kind of helped me say, this is pure escapism, and I like it, that it's pure escapism, and it's an easy read, and I don't have to think. I can escape to the world of Atticus O'Sullivan with joy. And I don't think we should look down on escapism any more than we look down on the mighty striving of worthy topics that you also cover in some of your favorites.
Yeah, on escapism, Tolkien has a little paragraph, which I cannot remember because I do not have it by memory, but we will put a link to it on the liner notes, because he's exact about exactly that.
Yes.
I was about to say, I couldn't remember who said it, but it was Tolkien, yes, of
Yes.
course.
I like all of them for the, some of them that take you away, some of them that don't take you away, but there's a lot of, I want to say there was a quote that may or may not be Tolkien of fantasy is escapist and that is its glory. But I also liked what Terry Pratchett says about fantasy being where the falling angel meets the rising ape.
Yes, absolutely. It's a beautiful line.
Also, what I tend to tell people 2 things. One, all fiction is fantasy by definition, because
Yes.
and the fact that we're labeling one of them with a capital F is just a subset of the whole thing. So stop nagging on it. You're reading fantasy, even if you're reading high literary crap. It's still fantasy. And the second thing is that in terms of escapism, it's part of it, but the other thing about fantasy is that the hidden gift is that it can wrap a hard truth into a tissue of silver, and you're going to swallow it whole, and you're going to internalize the hard truth without realizing that you've learned it. And somehow that comes out to the surface when you most need it. But you're not standing on a soapbox. You're not pontificating. You're not telling people the things that they have to, must do, that they absolutely need to, do right now. Everything's good. Everything's bad. There's no absolutes. You're giving them a truth. And whether or not they realize it, they will learn something from it, even though it's been buried into the depths of that fantasy. You mightn't even realize it's there, but the pearl is in the oyster.
It is an interesting thing that even some of my favorite writers, sorry about this, Kit, who have said literature, not, just fantasy. And I jumped on her live and in person in her living room, that I don't believe that literature is just happens to other people that we can't relate to. I mean, I'm sorry, but Faulkner and Hemingway, the old man in the sea and all that, I can't relate to any of that.
Oh my God, snobbery that exists. I mean, there was a very, very obvious instance of this because I was contacted a couple of years ago by a local university group. This is a university town where I live, so there's a lot of stuff going on like this. And I was contacted by a university group from the languages department, and they said, you're a local author, and would you like to come and do a reading, and yada, yada, yada. And then they disinvited me when they figured out that I'm
That you were what? A fantasy writer?
Yep.
Oh, that's shameful and ignorant.
I just want to state for nothing that having read a great number of U.S. history books through the years, there is a lot of fantasy out there in the school systems right now.
Yep.
Starting with Columbus was a lovely young boy who loved the sea, If anything, it's like, I shall describe in general the events that led up to. I mean, I think we all appreciate the Heather Cox Richardson of today for giving us the non-fantasy view of what's actually happening. And I'm hoping that all of these books and writings will go back, and it's made me appreciate memoirists that we've interviewed too for being, hey, this was like Lamlash Street in the 60s in London, was a whole lot of truths that when you look at it and say, do we realize that the implication of her grandmother living alone and grandfather was dead and she had boyfriends in the afternoons and we were forbidden to visit her? I'm like, because grandmother needed to support herself and that's how you did it, but we didn't put labels on it, but that was still happening and that was more real than anything I'd else read about the Britain in the 60s from the history books and the lofty, my nose is being pushed up here, literature on the topic, because they're real,
Yeah, absolutely.
And that is one of the things that I loved about your book, is that you make it very real.
I just finished reading I'm going to call it a novella. It just won recently established and fairly prestigious literary prize, and the back blurb of it kind of got me, but it wasn't quite honest. And when I realized what I was reading was basically a study of grief masquerading as a zombie novel.
Well, on the other hand, I could actually see that parallel beautifully. Does not grief make zombies of us all, shambling about in our clothes that need washing?
Is that by the time I was sort of waded in, so it's so far for it to be a sunk cost not to finish it. My sort of nutshell summation of my reaction to this book was, this is a New Yorker short story that's been expanded to a novella.
Right.
I can see that.
It was high literary. It was like, my nose is up in the air now. It was very literature. And I can see why, people who give out awards were possibly drawn to this, but I was just bored.
I have a friend, Amber Nelson, when last I touched base with her, she was up in Seattle, but she could be anywhere. She's been published in many magazines and produced chapbooks, etc., on poetry. And she's like, I tried to say, hey, I wrote this in the style of Dorothy Parker, and I sent it to the New Yorker, and I got turned down over and over again. And she read it, and she's like, oh, Jeannie, this is hopelessly 1920s poetry. If you want to write modern poetry, there has to be pavement and streetlights and rain and the word shit or fuck at least once. And I thought, Amber, you exaggerate. And then I went out to read, and Amber is right. And you should never argue with a poet about what is currently popular. Mm-hmm. Also, I didn't realize that there were trends in poetry in the same way. So I have learned so very wrong I was. What are the trends we're seeing today? It feels like there's a lot of fantasy out there, and I am loving that there's so many independent presses because we are seeing more variety in them. But you who are called upon and write reviews and publish them, what are you seeing in trends and how have they affected you?
I'm heartened by the fact that there's an Alex Harrow out there and that she's getting published and that people are loving it. And that means that there is a certain kind of level of writing or story that remains a core value, which matters to me in a big way. I absolutely despise fantasies with a capital F, which are basically wrapped around the fact that, oh, there's a dragon in here, so therefore it's a fantasy.
Yes. I used to say that I didn't like the fantasies that made me learn the kingdom of what's it and the land of who's it with the crown prince of this and nothing, you're going to make me have a whole events and it's all feudal, which doesn't hold together, but for the wrong reasons. And I always say that the people who wrote those kinds of fantasies didn't necessarily understand history or sociology.
Or read it.
Or political science. And so, on the other hand, I had the good, I don't know if you'd run into them, because I confess I didn't get to your last couple chapters, but reading things like the Hanuvar series from Robert Jones, and I'll correct this in a second, the nice man who is the Bane writer that we've interviewed, because his writing of the fall of his empire of the Lord of the Shattered Land started with a Roman area taken over in a very similar setting to what it could have been, only with myth and magic. And his sword and sorcery was what I had wanted the ones of the 70s to be, whereas I didn't quite love the 70s in that way all the time. I read Cormac McArts from Robert E. Howard, and all of it was his sword wove a web of death in every single book. It was like his Bond, James Bond.
Yeah.
And that's how you knew that you were reading a Cormac McArt book. And they had a sameness and the misogyny and this. And that's what I loved about the Chronicles of Hanuvar generally, and in particular, the writer Howard Andrew Jones, because he glorifies women in his own way while turning it a whole genre upside down.
Yeah.
That women can be generals and 50-year-old men can listen to 12-year-old girls when they have a plan. And that would have never happened in anything written in the 70s by some of our hallowed forefathers writing in fantasy. And I think that is my encouragement for some of the modern authors coming out, is they're saying, I might like sword and sorcery, but I don't have to be a git about it.
Some of the big name people who insist they don't write genre, but they do, like Margaret Atwood. But recently, or not so much recently, when did this happen? A while ago, when that maniac attacked Salman Rushdie with a knife, I basically turned up at that event in my head and I went, this is ridiculous. Why on earth he's a writer? Like, for God's sake, the world has gone insane. And now I need to read his latest book just because this happened to him. So I picked up Victory City and I read it.
What did you think?
Let me put it this way. There was a panel that I was on years ago at the convention that I forget which one. It's all blurry. I've been to so many. But there was a panel that I actually remember because we didn't get anything done on it because we spent 90% of it trying to figure out the definitions of what we were trying to be talking about.
Yeah.
And the two things that we were talking about were historical fantasy and alternate history.
Interesting.
What defines those two things? And the panel just couldn't come to an agreement as to what the anchors were that we could discuss this. And Victory City is this uneasy thing that kind of sits there in a world that purports to be real, because there are hints at real historical things like the Mughal Empire and the setting in India, and you know that this is a real place in a real time, and yet the core of it is a city that was grown from seed, and therefore they did not exist in a real world, but they keep on referring back to the real world, which kind of threw me out of that book so hard.
So then there's three of them. There's Harry Turtledove for alternative history, and then Sharon K. Penman, which you write about so lovingly, as the historical fiction, and then there's historical fantasy with you add a dragon and a grown egg thing, right?
Yep.
Hey, as a sometime writer of historical fantasy, don't dismiss it that easily.
Oh, please understand, I'm not dismissing it, I'm embracing it enthusiastically.
Fantasy is worth its weight not in gold, but in anything precious that you can value, that you can deem as value. And the historical fantasy is the love of mine, and I love it. And good historical fantasy, written well, is a treasure.
That's right. I'm going to have to send you my Barnabas book to see, because that is 1901 is historic fantasy.
Absolutely.
And I was very passionate about looking up. I wanted to set it just real enough so that anybody who is an actual historian would say, yes, there was poisoned beer in England in 1901, because that's very exciting to me.
Yeah.
And what happened to all those children? And because there's so many interesting things that happen in a world, and it is the privilege of the author to dump just enough real in there to have somebody say, I know about that. And it's like a hook in your brain, isn't it? Yes, that's real. Therefore, I now accept everything else absolutely has to be real.
That's how the process works.
Yeah.
How it should do. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So that's why I'm willing to, still believe in Oh, yeah, absolutely. There were the fae and there were witches
Yeah.
and there were demons and all of the fun stuff, shamanism and the gods of any age, because there's just enough fact to hang it on to say, yeah, I'll buy that.
It's the small truths that make you buy the big lie.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
Again, Terry Pratchett, God bless him.
Yeah.
You're going through, when you went through, you were talking about the different books you read at different times in your life. And I have to say, my hat is off to you. And you've made me go up and look up a number of the different poets, because there is such a combination of where the lyric feeling of poetry flows into prose, and how important that is to write a scene where you see it, you smell it, you taste it, you might have just sat in it accidentally, and it certainly might be clinging to the bottom of your shoe.
You do know my Roger Zelazny story, don't you?
I don't.
I mean, this is a writer. This is a man I read a lot of and I absolutely idolized. I mean, he's a god in my literary pantheon, and there's no going around that. I just think that he's magnificent. And back in 1996, was it? Back when I was in New Zealand, I'd never heard of a science fiction convention in my life, but there was this tiny little hole in the wall fantasy science fiction bookshop that long since gone, but bless them, when they exist, they're wonderful. And they had a leaflet that said there was going to be a science fiction convention over the Easter weekend of that year. And I kind of went, huh, okay, interesting. What's a con? And then they kind of said, well, there's going to be two guests of honor. And one of them was Vonda McIntyre. And that meant nothing to me because at that point I had not read anything by her. I didn't know who she was. But the other one was Roger Zelazny.
Oh.
And my eyes went out in stalks, and I went, oh, my dear God, I have to go to this. And then I found out further that they were doing a writer's workshop, and you had to submit a story, and it was going to be 5 people who would be accepted. And then the format would be, we would all get together at the convention, that we would kind of throw the stories at each other, like the writers, and then the 2 pros would weigh in. And so I sent in a story like 6 months before anybody else ever thought about it. And then I spent the rest of that year gnawing my fingernails going, oh my God, I sent that story. If he reads it, he's going to read that. He's going to think I'm a complete idiot. Why did I send that story? Oh my God. I actually got on. There was me and 4 other dweebs that got onto this workshop. And there we were sitting in this room. And Vonda McIntyre handed me back my manuscript, annotated to an inch of its life. She was writing in the margin. She was writing between the lines. She was writing anywhere there was an empty spot to be written on. And I basically learned more about writing from that one manuscript than I would have learned in a semester of writing classes somewhere else. But when the sort of the real important moment came, and I'm sitting next to Roger Zelazny, he's sitting right next to me on my left, and he's just sitting there, and there's nothing in front of him, no papers, no nothing. And he's just looking at me, and he had these gray eyes, Damascus steel eyes. He just looked at me from those gray eyes, and he said, I've got 2 questions for you. He said, how long have you been writing? And I kind of said, since I could hold a pencil, and before that I told lies. And he said, and have you read and or written a lot of poetry? And I had to say yes, because I was weaned on it. My grandfather was a poet. He read me his sonnets when I was 5. I grew up on this. Poetry is part of my blood. And I kind of admitted to this. And Roger Zelazny said, it shows you have a voice all of your own. No one else is going to write like this ever.
Oh,
that's lovely.
Basically, they scraped me off the floor into a bucket after that.
And you thought to yourself, maybe conventions are worthwhile. I should do them.
Here's the thing. This was Easter weekend that year. By June of that year, he was gone.
Yeah, I was going to say, it must be very close to the end.
That was the last convention that he was at.
Yes.
I just state for nothing that everybody who is hearing this needs to, if you have not, go out and read A Night in the Lonesome October. It is told from the point of view of Jack the Ripper's dog. And you might think to yourself, of all the horrific things that have ever happened in the world, you would never, ever sympathize for a mad serial killer. And then suddenly you realize that, no, he's a good guy. That is the power of Roger Zelazny and other authors, is to say, this is a perspective that you might have never considered and yet is vitally important for the survival of our species.
When you finish that, go read Doorways in the Sand, because
Yes.
And Lord of Light.
Yeah.
Light.
And the Amber series.
You were right in your book when you were writing about the Amber series that it is true. It is the most oddly cyclical, good guys are bad guys are good guys, and they are so complex. And I too wanted a family tarot, except for now I want my friends on them. I view Zoom as the closest I'm ever going to get to the Amber family tarot, and I appreciate that. But I can't travel through it.
No.
I actually took one of I had a really ancient set of paperback, the first 5 Amber books. And when I owned them at that convention, so I took my 9 prints in Amber for him to sign, and he just looked at this thing and his eyebrows went up into his hair and went, how long ago did you get this? It's been out of
Exactly. No. And that is sort of what I love about how you go through and tell in this book, both the stories, both the way that you have of describing other people made it fun for me to say, yes, that's it exactly. Or, okay, I don't know, but now I have to think about this again. So either way, it wakes your brain up, and I love that. So I appreciated that from what you came through. And also being another person, it seems that in many places in the world, people are deciding, well, what's a children's book in the end? I feel that your story of the alchemy and the word with dreams and transformations is very much a children's book is a book that a child reads and loves.
Absolutely.
And it's not really a topic. It's not really, there's no concepts that are too adult for that. Oh my goodness, adults have sex in this novel. That did not make me want to have sex in this novel, in the same way that I realized I was never going to be able to sprout wings and turn into a dragon, or follow a mouse down the mouse hole into a hidden kingdom and where I would win my fortune. I mean, this is
where I was very, very fortunate, and you don't really appreciate your blessings until they're gone. But I had extraordinary ancestors. My grandfather, the poet, when he trusted me with his poems when I was 5 years old, my parents, who never forbade me anything. I mean, if I could read it, I was allowed to read it. I found my own level, and they allowed me to do that. My father was the one who took me by the hand when I was 7 years old and had gone through the entire kiddie section of my local library. And he went to the library with me, and he said to the librarian, give her an adult card.
Oh.
I don't even remember having kids versus adult cards. I just had a library card because I spent summer visiting my grandparents, and the children's section, although they did have all 24 odd Oz books, but reading through, they run it. So I went over into the horror section, and anybody who thinks that Flowers in the Attic is great for a 9-year-old. On the other hand, I learned all about, so I started categorizing, here's John Saul, it's horror. I didn't particularly love it, but desperate times and a desperate need to read mean, there's only so much Winston Churchill you can read before you really need, sure, the doll is possessed by demons, fine, whatever, let's go. My grandfather was a lover of poetry, and he was the one, if you said a line, I can't remember, I could call up my grandfather and say, what is it, the pirate Don Dirk of Dowdee? And he would immediately say, was as wicked could be, but oh, he was perfectly lovely. And he could recite the whole poem for you and tell you who wrote it and what it was about, because he had a perfect memory for poetry, although I don't think he ever wrote it himself. Poetry, I lament with you that I think poetry is important and should be more in the world and should be more in part of what people read, because if you don't understand the beauty of how words all tangle together, how are you really going to appreciate fiction?
Yeah. Let alone create it.
Let alone create it.
An occasion where somebody's going to come up to you because you're a writer, and I'm sure you guys were going to start nodding as soon as I open my mouth now, but they're going to say, I want to be a writer. I want to write a book someday. And so you ask them, well, what do you read? Oh, I don't read very much.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, so you're not actually going to write it. Okay. Then I say things like, oh, best wishes, or what a fine idea. You should go do that, and assume that they won't. Or as opposed to well, I've written so many stories and now I think I'm ready to write a novel. I'm like, absolutely you should.
Yeah. Right.
Where are you going? How what is the story that somebody said, I want more? Or this is a lot of world building. It seems a shame to waste on 6,000 words. Do you want to go on with that?
There was one particular occasion in which I saw they were going to be putting together an anthology that was supposed to be about weird creatures, as in, don't do werewolves, give us your other creatures, give us the rest of it. So I started writing a story for that anthology, and the story turned into a novel, and the novel turned into a trilogy.
Uh-huh.
Right. I can see that happened. I wrote a short story, and that's how I came up with my Bluebirds, which are not available for knowledge yet, but I'm 2 novels in.
Yeah.
Just want to start writing the 3rd, and I'll probably get it out there. Your Alchemy of the Word, Dreams and Transformations, we see that it is already mentioned for pre-order on Amazon. Is this coming out at the end of the month, or when can people expect to be able to buy a copy?
Slated for 26th of November so far.
So for the long weekend, people actually have something to do.
Yep.
Besides talk to their family and that racist uncle that they don't want to.
Sidle off to the nearest bookshelf and check it out.
I think that's important. And I want to say to listeners out there, if you're just like, I don't know if I need to read this, or I don't, want to get close to, this might remind you even of things that you'd forgotten how much you loved. And just that reawakened sense of wonder within yourself.
There's that thing about people writing about reading. It's a shared thing. It's like talking to someone about a book. When you're reading somebody else talking about a book that you love too. I do want to mention Jo Walton's book, among others. It's a novel, but it is... She and I basically shared a childhood. She was in Wales and I was in Oxford. But we were growing up at the same time and reading all the science fiction we could lay our hands on in England, in the UK. And this book is structured absolutely around this young girl and how her reading is affecting her life. Almost all those books, she read them, I read them. It was like we walked hand in hand through that story. It was amazing.
Yeah, and just that relation that you have to either another person and then to the writers you forgot how much you loved until somebody else brings them up again.
Yeah.
Sort of shared cultural childhood that people fall into, you and Joe and me and a couple of people say on Facebook that know exactly what I'm talking. I mean, when I was growing up, it was a sort of regional cultural thing to read Karl May. And Karl May was a German writer who wrote about things like Arabian deserts and the American Wild West without ever having been in either.
Yeah.
And essentially, it took me years to unlearn everything I thought I knew about the Apache.
Yeah, I can see that.
But quite honestly, this is the kind of book that it's got a Mary Sue that's in the heart of it, that's bigger than the monolith in 2001. The main character, the main protagonist is basically a young German who turns up in the American Wild West and becomes blood brothers with the son of the chief of the Apaches, like Winnetou.
Sure. Well, it's, I guess, like the last of the Mohicans. We must all be there with Uncas.
Yes.
Wish fulfillment fantasy of the noble savage and the American. Never mind. The whole thing has got problems up the wazoo, but it's the first book that made me cry.
No.
And that's still important.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
Even if somebody's first novel is somebody by, we read later and discover that L. Frank Baum was a suffragette raised by women and women's rights in the 1920s. And if you read some of it, it's, oh dear. I try to say that, in the 1920s, he was what progressive was. And so it is still a bellwether to understand where the winds are going to blow.
Yeah.
This particular guy, the Karl May character, is because if I mention his name in certain circles of people who grew up in the same geographical region that I did at roughly the same time, there's going to be a lot of head nodding because everybody read it.
Exactly. Whereas some of us find things later. Like it was only a couple years ago that I have a friend who, Kharkiv, Ukraine, who said, hey, you should read these Witcher novels. There's a video game on them. And this was before the TV show ever came out. And I loved them. Mm-hmm. I absolutely loved them, which made me, when the TV show came out, I'm like, you're ruining it. They're getting it wrong because they were the most genius of what if all of the fairy tales were real, and yet he brought in a very political science, social studies realism to it too. For instance, when I read old fairy tales, the most realistic one ever is the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Mm-hmm. Here's a man that does pest disposal and removal and gets stiffed by the city for money. Like, that could happen today. And why somebody hasn't rewritten that, I don't know. But if you're out there, write it now.
Is that a challenge?
Yes. Yes, it is. Yes, so November 26th. I think you all need to go out and read this book because it will be out and it is fantastic. And everyone, please, buy Alchemy of the Word, Dreams and Transformations. It will get you through the long weekend, and it's going to, one, you'll get to know and love Alma as much as we love her. And two, you're probably going to go out and pick up a few books that maybe you didn't have already, but you should.
Yeah.
Hope so.
And what are you working on now? What are we going to expect next out of you now that this labor of the love is hitting the newsstands, as it were?
One of the things that I kind of shot off in a sort of relatively short time of working on it, and it's out now too, is a little book called What the Censored Is It About Cats?
You know, interesting. We were just talking amongst ourselves about we should probably have an episode entirely devoted to cats.
Well, yeah. Yeah.
Especially cats in fiction and cats in all of these others. So
You permit me to actually reveal the underlying censored word, but there was a panel in a WorldCon many years ago, which was the best attended panel I've ever been on. There were 4 of us on the panel, and there was no room in the room. People were in every chair. People were sitting on the floor. People were along the walls. People were sitting behind us at the table. There were people clustered on the door, peering in. The panel was, what the fuck is it about cats?
oh, that's beautiful.
For the rest of the convention, never mind what else we were there for and what we did, random people we didn't know would stop us in the corridor and go, oh, you were in the cat panel.
Yep.
So there's this thing about cats, as specifically about writers' cats.
Well, we were looking through cats throughout history. You know, cats, how many cats have been in through literary history and important? It's before it was the cat who walked through walls and the cat, you know, the door into summer, and how many other the cat thriller books are out there, I forget. But
Yes.
cats have always been important.
Yes.
Much like, you know, it's a tragedy or drama if the dog dies, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're chaos. I mean, chaos. We watched a man kill a newborn infant and it was like, oh, yeah, that's icky. But whatever, because that's just you expect it. But when they murder the kitten, I mean, up in arms, everybody.
Yeah. Don't kill the cat. Don't kill the cat.
We're used to people killing humans, but, you know, kitty. I totally get that.
When my husband and I kind of split charities between us, he was very much a people person, and he was always running around helping people. And I was going, you know, people, that's great. I agree with that. But also, people have voices, animals don't. And I'm the one that's going to speak up for the animals. While you're running around helping people, I'm going to be helping cats and dogs.
I entirely agree. Well, we will put links to the fascinating things we discussed during this episode on our website, which is www.writersdrinkingcoffee. Alma now owes me the link to her favorite animal charity in the area. Thank you so much for the talking time to talk with us today.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to Writers Drinking Coffee, a labor of love and enthusiasm put together by the hosts. Our main web magic is cast by Deirdre Schween, and our sound engineer and backup web spiders are David Welsh, John Schmidt, and Ksenia Cherevskia. Our intro and exit music is performed by Michael Ingberg, who lives down under in Hervey Bay and runs Tin Can Music School. Our podcast sponsors are Jackal Designs, The Bean Scene, Arm Street, and definitely all of the animal shelters that take in cats and try to find homes for them. And hey, thank you for listening.